Our next book that we're going to be looking at is by Carl Ernst and Patrick de Silva, and it's called Breathtaking Revelations, The Science of Breath from the 50 Kamarupa verses to Hazrat Inayat Khan. And Supriya Gandhi is going to be telling us about that and asking them some questions. Carl Ernst is the first author of this book. He's an academic specialist in Islamic studies with a focus on West and South Asia. He's received research fellowships from the Fulbright Program, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. And he's been elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He studied comparative religion at Stanford University and then at Harvard for his PhD. He's taught at Pomona College and has been on the faculty of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he's now William R. Kennan Jr., Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies Emeritus. And so welcome, Carl. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
His co-author is Patrick de Silva, who specializes in the study of Muslim engagement with yoga, with an emphasis on the Persianate world. He completed his BA in Religious Studies and Classics at Macalester College at the University of North, hang on, have I got this right? Macalester College, yes. His master's is in Theological Studies at Harvard Divinity School, and his PhD is in Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's currently researching the rise of yoga in the West, as well as the interplay of race, religion, and cultural appropriation in science fiction, which sounds a lot of fun. He's a visiting teaching assistant professor of Islamic studies at the University of Denver, and he lives in Boulder, Colorado with his family. And to introduce their book, we have Supriya Gandhi, who teaches in the Department of Religious Studies at Yale University. She's the author of The Emperor Who Never Was, Dara Shukor in Mughal India. And she's also written articles and essays on a variety of topics, including Persian renditions of the Ramayana, Persian writings on Dharma Shastra and Vedanta, imperial approaches to comparative religion, discourses of racialization and caste in Mughal India, the rise of scriptural Hinduism in the 19th century, and Hindu nationalism. Her current book project draws on a corpus of Persian and Urdu works to explore histories of religious universalism in modern India. She grew up in India and studied there, as well as in the UK, Iran, and Syria, before earning her doctorate at Harvard. Her research has been supported by grants from the Fulbright and ACLS Mellon Foundations. So thank you very much for joining us. And Supriya, I will pass over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the organizers of this conference and to my co-panelists. I must add that, Professor Carl Ernst has been an early mentor of mine and, one of the people sort of most responsible for my academic trajectory. So it's a delight and an honor to be in conversation with both Professor Ernst and Dr. de Silva today. To say a few words, before I begin to the questions, I'd like to say a few words about this work, this translation that we have, and its importance. The juxtaposition of the translation of the 50 Kamarupa verses and the Science of Breath by Hazrat Inayat Khan is really, together, this really produces a landmark in our understanding of the histories of yoga, Sufism, and global interreligious encounter. And throughout his career, Carl Ernst has really been an exemplary model in terms of methodology and content when it comes to examining how the histories of yoga are also entangled with the histories of Islam and Sufism. And Carl Ernst's work does this in a couple of ways, both in terms of methodology as well as in content. Professor Ernst's methodology helps us to break down essentialized ideas about religions. So the questions of what is yoga, what is Sufism, what is Islam, are are not addressed in an essentialized way. For Professor Ernst, through his work, there is no essentialized tradition of yoga or Sufism existing in a vacuum as these two sealed off separate entities. These traditions are always debated, changing, contingent on context, and always in formation shaped by mutual encounters. So in the translation of the 50 Kamarupa verses, we really see sort of an example of this particular approach. Professor Ernst's corpus of work has also helped us understand a lot of the granular details about the histories of these encounters, and really show how important the work of Muslim and scholars has been for a broader understanding of the history of yoga. So to this end, Professor Ernst has contributed extensive research on Arabic and Persian renditions of a Sanskrit work that is presented as the Amrit Kund, or the Pool of Nectar. And these works also cover a lot of similar themes and topics to the 50 Kamarupa verses. And Professor Ernst has also worked on a number of Chishti writings on yoga, and so has Dr. De Silva, so written about the history of Arabic and Persian writings on breathing practices. Now, when it comes to the question of what kinds of yogic practices and works were of interest to Muslim scholars, we see a couple of themes. We see a sustained interest in occult and divinatory practices. So Svarodaya or breath divination, as well as a sustained interest in summoning goddesses. So there are ways in which Tantra comes to be folded into a lot of these early texts. And I might add a work that I have done a little bit of research on, and this is the mid-13th century Kitab Shamil of the Central Asian polymath Sirajuddin as-Sakaki. And in as-Sakaki's work, we also see an interest in summoning goddesses. Many of the goddesses mentioned there are very similar to those mentioned in the 50 Kamrup verses. So we see how at a time when Tantra is seen to be in a decline, as the narrative goes, Tantra has been displaced by Islam. So while it gets displaced, it also gets domesticated and preserved in these Arabic and Persian texts, on which the work of Professor Ernst and Dr. De Silva shines a light. And we also see that these works tend to be highly mobile. So whether it's the Bahrul Hayat or the renditions of the Amrit Kunda, as well as the 50 Kamrup verses, these have long afterlives and travels. So I'm going to proceed now to the questions that I will put to Professor Ernst and Dr. Silva, and I have three sets of questions. My first question is about the approaches of each of these works and the way in which they present the knowledge of breath divination, and in the Kamrup verses context, as well as the rites of summoning goddesses. Now, there seems to be a contrast in how they are presenting their engagement with the tradition of yoga. For the Kamrup Panchashika, there is a very important sense that it is the goddess who's a transmitter, that this indeed has an authority by its closeness to the Sanskrit texts, the preservation of Sanskrit words, even if perhaps they come out sometimes rather garbled in the Perso-Arabic script. But there's an idea of an original authoritative text and a transmission via a teacher or a devi, and this is also similar to other works like Bahrul Hayat as well as Sakaki's work. And then there's a contrast with Hazrat Inayat Khan's work, where the emphasis is on viewing breaths in Islamic terms through Jamal and Jalal and sort of Kamal, or in a more universalistic way, and yet it has a strong similarity with, as you've pointed out, with Hatha Yoga texts. So Professor Ernst, if you could answer, sort of maybe introduce the Kamarupa Shashika and address how it presents the knowledge of breath divination and rites of summoning goddesses that it discusses. And then following that, if, Dr. De Silva, if you could discuss Inayat Khan's science of breath, and how would you characterize the ways in which Inayat Khan presents these theories and techniques of the breath?
Well, thank you very much, Supriya, for that very generous introduction and for your astute comments. Regarding the 50 Kamarupa verses, it's a very early text. We know that it's before 1350. And it is a text that is interested in practice. It is, as you mentioned, focused on occult practices as well as divination and the summoning of goddesses. Although they're not called goddesses, they're referred to as spiritual beings. And so they're made to fit more comfortably into the Islamic multiverse that way. Now, I think it's important to note that later texts tend to add more theory, and including medical and cosmological interpretations that come from the Islamicate tradition, including the Galenic medical tradition and the Ptolemaic system. And there was little attempt to reproduce the philosophical apparatus that is linked to yoga in the Sanskrit tradition. So the 50 Kamarupa verses also, I suspect, may have been duplicated in effect by the name of Amrita Kunda, because we don't know of a separate text with this title. And there are 4 of the manuscripts, at least, of the 50 Kamarupa verses, which state that the source is the Amrita Kunda, which is the same as the 50 Kamarupa verses. So this is probably the first level of major recuperation of yogic practices in Persian. Now, later ones, which including some from the Chishti tradition, have a somewhat more comprehensive attempt to link the Indic and Islamicate traditions. And so there, for instance, we find the description of the physiological system of the subtle nerves and so forth is amply stated out, but it's not really integrated with the Islamicate materials. But there are new interpretations that link yogic experiences to verses from the Quran. So it's a very complex phenomenon. The later traditions are employing a tradition of translation, which is very different from what we're used to. Instead of trying to restore the original text and sources from which these arrived, they're thinking forward and trying to make this available to an audience. And so both the Arabic version of the pool of water of life and its Persian translation, the ocean of life, are about 1/3 consisting of materials which have nothing to do with India, and which supply an interpretive hermeneutic for that. So there's no word, the word yoga is hardly used at all in these texts. There's no comprehensive sense of what this discipline might be. But it's constantly being subordinated to categories like the zikr of the Sufis to describe the mantras and so forth. So there is a sense in which this is undergoing a very deep engagement with Islamic interpretation. And I think that's a good point for me to turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Carl. And Supriya, it's wonderful to finally meet you virtually. And thank you, as Carl said, for your wonderful introduction. Well, you mentioned that Hazrat Inayat Khan establishes or has more of a universalist kind of inclination. And I think that's a very important piece of understanding how he fits this science of breath into the context that we are discussing. So he the manuscript that we received of this science of breath teaching was apparently narrated to one of his disciples actually in London, in the early part of the 20th century, like 18 or 1919. And what's amazing to me is that you can find in Hazrat Inayat Khan's previously published writings, there's a collection called The Mysticism of Sound and Music. And throughout that work, which is a collection of some of his teachings, he references science of breath. He references things that Sufis learned from yogis, or people in India practice this, and he's very explicit about linking it to Mahadev, or to the god Shiva. And in this teaching, in the science of breath, again, it's just sort of more this is the teaching that he is referencing in those collected sort of lectures in the mysticism of sound and music. And as you noted, he uses a different set of categories, Jamal, Jalal, Kamal, to account for the different nadis, because that's in part what the svara is supposed to be flowing through. And also other elements of that work are universalist, not just in terms of this linking it to Shaivite Tantra, but also, he references the Gospel of John and this idea of, Jesus as the logos, or the word. He also updates the things that we're talking about in terms of divination. So if the older teachings talk about consulting your breath for, short, traveling nearby or traveling far away, well, Hazrat Inayat Khan references, if you're going to take the Zeppelin, if you're going to consult with a medium. These are ways in which, as you mentioned, Supriya, that the texts are mobile. It's been amazing to look at how these texts have been updated to fit with their audience. And that's something that I think I especially want to continue researching, is what can we tell about the audiences of these work through the ways that these authors and translators are essentially marketing them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we really see a contrast here between, in the sort of the place of what we might consider the occult or the esoteric in this earlier work, the Kamarupa Panchachika, and then the science of breath as produced in a time of perhaps greater disenchantment, when there are certain boundaries, between science and religion. So to sort of move on to my next stage of questions. And let me ask Professor Ernst first. Could you say a little about the broader circulation of the Kamarupa Panchachika, both sort of, in terms of like region as well as time?
Well, that's a very good point. There were numerous abridgments and adaptations, one of which is quoted in a Persian encyclopedia that was written about 1350. And it describes the two features of the text as being the science of breath and the science of the imagination. And this manages to include the chakras and mantras associated with them, as well as the divination and the summoning of goddess spirits. Now, there's only one copy of the complete text, which is what is translated in the book. And this is in a manuscript that was acquired by the Italian traveler Pietro della Valle while he was in Persia in 1622. And there, they copied this manuscript for him, a group of intellectuals he was visiting. And in exchange, he wrote for them a Persian translation of a Latin work on astronomy by Kepler. So it was an interesting group of cosmopolitan exchanges that was going on. Now, the vast majority of the manuscripts of the abridgments are found in Persia and were being written on and commented on right up to the present day. In the 19th century, an Iranian scholar included this abridged version in one of his very popular anthologies, and it's found on the website of a current Iranian Ayatollah. So there's always a little bit of a qualification in the comments that are made by the Persian scholars. They say, this is not a science that relates to the Prophet Muhammad or Islam, but it works. And so the emphasis on practicality and practice is kind of a constant feature of it. And this is also repeated by Bellavalle himself. He says, I tried it and it works. Well, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it's kind of intriguing. So go ahead.
So this, I mean, this is this is fascinating for me, and I'm sure for the audience as well, in terms of just the broader trans-regional reach. And I just wanted to point out again that Sakaki's work, possibly, because Sakaki died in the mid-1200s, so that might even possibly predate the Kamarupa and Shashaka, and that was in Arabic. And has a lot of the similar mantras in the section on the goddesses. Sakaki focuses much more on the spells and on the azaim, but he has very similar comments about Homa and Japa, and about the various devis who are kind of propitiated and then subjugated. So there seems to be certain intertextual elements there, that there are these Sanskrit mantras that are circulating in Arabic and Persian, and often and outside South Asia, or in regions contiguous to South Asia.
Well, that's true. And in fact, the oldest manuscript of the Bahr al-Hayat of Muhammad Ghaus, which is a later stage in this process, is in Tashkent.
Wow. Yeah.
So that indicates that the circulation was going on in an early stage for that as well. And then, of course, for the Arabic version, there are over 90 manuscripts, and the majority are in Turkey, Egypt, and Syria. So this shows us how widely this was being transmitted.
And thank you. And Patrick, could you comment a little bit perhaps on just the broader, some of Hazrat Inayat Khan's interlocutors, or what you might guess about, about its use, and like practice or transmission within his lineage or elsewhere?
Of course. I mean, I think the context in which he is disseminating these teachings, you had mentioned, used this great phrase of disenchantment. In some ways, the late 19th and into the early 20th century, we see a great interest, a huge interest in occultism, that in some ways we've sort of forgotten as part of our kind of trained occultophobia, at least in the US. And so Khan's teachings are a part of that. I feel like, it's very telling that he uses the term science. And that's a consistent sort of translation of the Arabic ilm, or sometimes ma'rifa, and then the Persian equivalents. And it's seen as a technique, right? Something that, well, if you try it and it doesn't work out, you are the problem, right? You are the one who has made mistakes with your practice. And I think in terms of looking at the sort of Sufi order that he established and that continues to this day. If you look at the book, it's Hazrat Inayat Khan's grandson, Pir Zia Khan, who wrote a very nice sort of introduction for us. That these teachings are seen as important as they're not. No one is, at least especially within the order, is looking down on them. And divination, just speaking generally, is something that we as humans are incredibly motivated to continue to try, trying to figure out how to get from A to B, and can you find a lost object? What's the gender of the unborn child? How long are you going to live? When are you going to die? If so, like, what are the circumstances? What state should your breath be in before you go and meet with an important person? These are, sort of, I think, universal human concerns. And so the fact that Khan, in some ways, does a little bit more to Islamicize it through the aforementioned, taking sort of the solar breath and the lunar breath, and using Jamal and Jalal to describe those, tells us that even though he's acknowledging its non-Islamic kind of origins, the thing with the occult practices is people who are into it, what I've noticed is there's less of a concern about origins. There's less of an anxiety about origins because it's seen as something that's universally available to people. And so, for example, if we look at the Sanskrit Hindi texts on these teachings, they, like, for example, they tend to include a lot of stuff on the stars, the sun, the moon. So it's this astrological material. This stuff usually gets cut out of the Persian abridgments of the teachings. And that's not because these Persian and presumably Muslim editors don't believe in the power of like looking at the stars. Instead, they already have their own versions of those practices. And so there's an interest in what is new, what is different. This idea of using the breath, training yourself to be a passive recipient, or you're just noticing the breath, as opposed to, like, for example, with a zikr formula where you visualize the breath moving through your body as you recite the Shahada, is just as one example. Or even in pranayama, where you manipulate your breath to change your mind-body state in particular ways. This is more treating the body as a sort of a weather vane, if you will. And I think that's part of what Khan is speaking to when he updates the teachings and then shares it with his community in the early part of the 20th century. Yeah, I can go on, but I know we don't have tons of
So
time.
I think now we have to move to audience questions, and I'm sure there are a number.
We have a few. I have a really basic one, which maybe will help us gloss over. So you've mentioned several times the teachings. Is it possible to just give us an overview or a brief summary of the key teachings?
Right. Well, the 50 Kamarupa verses describes the divination of by the breaths of the lunar and solar nostrils, the left and right nostrils. And so it's telling you what to do that day according to how the breath is flowing. There are also incantations which are addressed to the goddesses. And this forms a large part of the repertoire, perhaps the last half of the book. And in addition, there's a tremendous emphasis on certain mantras. And one of the peculiar things about the text is that although these mantras are spelled in Persian, there is an attempt made to copy out the Devanagari form of the word in its original Sanskrit. And these are actually pretty much failures because the scribes were not really artists, they were scribes of the Arabic alphabet. And so everything they write looks like Arabic letters. But there's also another thing which happens in this. There are recipes for magical spells like destroying enemies. And so these are sometimes treated as esoteric and written in a numerical code. And the other thing about the text that is a bit confusing is that it looks like it was put together in a very sloppy fashion. There are at least 5 different places where it says this is the beginning of the book. Cross-references don't work. And it ends very abruptly. And so the author was not very skilled as a writer. But they continually insist upon, this is the greatest text in India. Everybody knows it. And all of the scholars are into it, even though we don't find very much of a trace of it as such under this title in the Sanskrit tradition. So the translator also in his explanation of how he dealt with the text gives several different versions of it. Sometimes he says that he was assisted by a Brahmin named Hari. One of his informants is a fairy. And he keeps saying that nobody understands the text like he does. So we're a little bit perplexed about who this person was. I think he was a magician who somehow got exposed to this tradition in a very exciting way. But there's many narratives also about Kamaki Devi and the 64 yoginis and their wonderful abode in Kamarupa, which is defined as either the frontier of China or somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So it's presented as esoteric, and there's not a comprehensive theory, as I said, to organize the whole thing. But there are countless recipes that tell you put together pieces of wood of the following trees, and then you recite something for 108 times, and you will get a certain result. And so it's like a collection of practices rather than a presentation of doctrines.
If I could just sort of add very quickly, the Arabic work by Sakaki that I was mentioning also has these sort of Nagari depictions of almost exactly the same seed syllables. And it seems to be
there's also some emphasis on coincidences. Like one of the favorite mantras is Hrim, H-R-I-M, in English translation. And this is always spelled as Rahim. And then it's said to be the same as Rahim, which is one of the Arabic names of God. And then one of my favorites is the Sanskrit word alakshana, which means without any qualification. In Hindi becomes alak, a phrase well known from some of the yogic groups who use the chant of Alak Niranjan, the transcendent, unqualified essence, to describe the absolute. And so if you write alak in Arabic, it looks strangely similar to the word Allah, which is considered to be a definitive point.
And if I can jump on this, I think it's also interesting the use of the codes of the numbers to hide some meanings and some sentences. And I mean, I was thinking about the audience. Do you think, Carl, there were people who could actually unpack this code so easily?
Well, it turns out to be a fairly easy code because it's linked to the numerical value of the Arabic alphabet in the most widely used ancient system, the so-called abjad. And so if you realize that, then it becomes easy. And the scribe made a couple of mistakes in transcription, so some of the formulas didn't come out quite right, but you can tell what it is. And there's also historic records of the use of this code going back to the 9th century. So I think that it was a way of kind of insulating the most momentous spells in the book, which have to do with life and death.
Yeah, they were like, and then he died. I mean, it's very strong. The sentence that is hidden is very strong, actually. And if I can ask another question, because I was very much, I mean, just perhaps because it's not my field of expertise and especially the language that I'm used to, but can you say something more about the use of the word imagination? I mean, if I understood properly, is to stress a kind of form of ascetic concentration, or didn't I get it?
Well, for a long time, I was trying to figure out if this word, the Arabic word is wahm, imagination, if this was an attempt to refer to a Sanskrit term of psychology of yoga, but I don't think so. And the fact is that this was used by a variety of authors, but it's primarily as a term in the philosophy of Ibn Sina, where the imagination is the faculty by which the angelic intellects create things from nothing. And so it is a very powerful form of energy which is available to people with advanced meditation techniques. And it's used frequently by many other authors, philosophical authors, Razi, Shahrastani, and others, as well as writers on the different religions of the East. So the imagination is essentially an Islamicate term which is being used to describe the mental powers of the yogis.
Mm.
And if I could just add one thing, maybe we haven't emphasized enough, is the whole rationale for including these two texts in a single volume, which is, many of us are teachers by trade, and we're unfortunately familiar with when students try to plagiarize things, and we have, computer programs that help us detect that. If you ran these two texts, the 50 Kamarupa verses and Hazrat Inayat Khan's Science of Breath, through plagiarism detector, it would flag everything. So there's an amazing amount of consistency between the earlier text that we date as probably earlier then, but we know certainly by 1350, and then Hazrat Inayat Khan's text in 1918, 1919, and that to me for this whole project has been quite incredible to sort of just learn more and more about it. And as Carl mentioned, all of these different abridged versions of the 50 verses that we find throughout the Persianate sort of world, from 1350 forwards and through to to 2013, which is when that one Ayatollah in Iran posted one of the abridgments of the 50 verses on his website. So it's simultaneously old, but also, apparently still relevant.
Yeah, I mean, if you read the book, your book, it really it's astonishing how you can see this kind of a continuity between one text and the others. I really appreciated this kind of putting together, let's say, the past and almost contemporary. And Patrick, I had a question about this Miss Zahra Williams, because this seems a kind of bridge. And can you tell us a bit more? Because she's described as a murid, right? So I was a bit like in a Sufi context to find this foreign woman described as a murid. I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing her up, because her story is one I would love to know much more about, because she's the one who takes the dictation of Khan, and so she I believe is a British woman who was one of his first murids, or sort of students or disciples, and I don't know much more about her. I've thought about sort of inquiring with the order, with the Inyatiya order, to learn more, see what additional information is available. But that also accounts for, we received two different manuscripts of Khan's teaching, so it was all, it had been scanned from something that originally had been typed out, and you got the feeling that what had been sort of typed out had originally been written out by hand, because there were portions where the scribe was like, oh, I'm not sure what the master said. Um, and so the text, and I really tried to do this with editing it for the book. It really flows much more like a lecture, or this oral teaching. Whereas, as Carl mentioned, with the 50 verses, I mean, how many books have 5 or more beginnings? I mean, that one, and so that lack of editing, is part of what we have. So it's stuff like that makes me excited to work with yet more manuscripts, because each one is different. There's no two that are the same. It's amazing.